So welcome back to Where Can Wisdom Be Found? As we turn to the eighth chapter together that we're going to read in a moment, what I wanted to do was just to turn for a few brief moments to kind of zoom out, and in the process of zooming out, to try to place this curriculum of Proverbs within a certain kind of zeitgeist. So what that means is it's a sort of like the spirit of the world. Where is the spirit of the world? Not just in terms of Judaism and not just in terms of the Hebrew Bible and the wisdom text that we're looking at, but where is the rest of humanity? And as I mentioned last time, Karl Jaspers, who died in 1969, pioneered this idea called the axial age. It's a very long period, but we begin to see that because we have so much of a difficulty with the carbon-14 dating of the text that we're looking at, there were a lot of things that were moving between uh, orality and the written text themselves. If we can please just mute for a moment. There was a lot of shifting between wisdom that was transmitted in an oral fashion and when it was actually written down. And that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to date a lot of these texts. But Jaspers, if we can just mute, please. So So part of what Jaspers is referring to is this period between 800 and 200 BCE, which he argues really underlies that moment in time where the foundations of what we consider to be current civilization came into being. So, Alan, when you're noticing this shift from agrarian lifestyle into the marketplace, this is really marketplace is one of the signs of civilization, and so it plays a very important role, a crucial role in human history and the evolution of the way that we think and the way that we are sharing ideas and the way that civilization emerges. And it's an important heuristic, it's an important tool that we can use because when you look and you notice that it wasn't just, for example, the author of Mishle, of Proverbs, or of Ecclesiastes, purported to be King Solomon, or the archetypal King Solomon, that was sharing these words of wisdom from the Jewish perspective. But you have religious leaders like Confucius and Buddha and Lao Tzu and Zarathustra that are all emerging around the same times. And Jasper's argument is there's something happening within the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, where he suggests that there is a shift in the way that humanity is thinking. Each religious culture and tribe has its own way of articulating what those ideas will look like in the particular garb uh, of the specific tribe. But there is a real importance in terms of beginning to try to appreciate and to understand how this is emerging and the way that it's affecting all of humanity. And so what we could say and probably agree on in very general terms, which I think is important for us to keep in mind as we look at the specificity of the program of the curriculum of Proverbs, is that much of the axial age was really about the meaning and purpose of life. Humanity now is asking this question: what is the meaning of my life? What is the purpose, or we would say the tachlis, the tachlit, the telos, the direction and purpose of my life? That's focusing now on a unique moment in the human species on the identity of the individual rather than the tribe. The individual rather than the collective becomes the focus, not exclusively, but becomes the main focus of these wisdom traditions. So we can see, for example, the Indian Upanishads focus on the Atman, which is the transcendent center of the self. It's a central concern for them, while Buddha charts the way towards individual enlightenment. The Jewish prophets are preaching moral responsibility for individuals, not just for society. Confucius is concerned for the ideal humane individual as a building block for a just society. And the curriculum of Proverbs is speaking to us about the importance that the individual is meant to cultivate in terms of character in relationship to the cosmos, in terms of cultivating wisdom, and how to be able to act within their life, specifically within the marketplace of ideas. And in many ways, that Proverbs is concerned with an axial age concern, um, which suggests that even though there might be a divine or supernatural source for these teachings, it's really now focusing on the ethics of individual moral responsibility. And so that's one of the things that's important to pay attention to. I just want us to keep that in mind as we're going through the shift from chapter 7 to chapter 8. And let's pay attention to see what is unique about this curriculum that we are able to learn from and to discern. We're going to go through it together. Was there a question before we go into that, Goldie?
Oh, I noticed what you were talking about just now, that in verse 4 of chapter 8, before they seem to be talking to their own tribe, but in verse 4 it says, "Unto you, O men, I call out, and my voice to humankind."
Good.
So now they're going out to it's becoming more universal, just what you were saying, that it's not only for the tribe, or for their own culture, but for humankind as a whole.
Good. So we're going to pay attention to exactly those kinds of details. I want you to keep track of the shift between the concern for the internal tribe, and the concern for the external collective of humanity, right? And we'll notice that the language that's there shifts into the language, as you pointed out, of Bnei Adam, humankind. It's not to Israel or to Ish Israel, but it's to Bnei Adam, and that's something that we're going to look at. What I'd like to do now is to go through the text together, to hear it, to pay attention to some of those peculiarities of language that Goldie is drawing our attention to, and then for us to see what emerges, and just to see how we can begin to tease out what is unique about the way in which Mishle is approaching its place within what Jaspers calls the axial age. Okay, so I'm going to begin. I'm going to go around the Zoom room. We'll read together, and hopefully you'll be able to each read 5, maybe 6 verses in the English with me. I'll read it in the Hebrew, and I'll just go around and call on each person. So please join me if you can. All right, so let's begin with chapter 8, Mishle. Halo chochma tikra utfuna titen kola, Marian. You just need to unmute. Yep.
Look, wisdom is calling and discernment is her voice.
Berosh meromim alei darech beit netivot nitzava.
At the highest heights on the way, at the crossroad, she takes her stand.
Liad sha'arim lefi karet mevo ptachim tarona.
By the gates, at the city's entrance, at the approach to the portals, she cries aloud.
Alechem ishim ekra v'koli el b'nei adam.
Unto you, O men, I call out, and my voice to humankind.
Havinu pta'im orma uksilim havinu lev.
Understand shrewdness, you dupes and fools. Make yourself open to an understanding heart.
Shim'u ki negidim adaber u'miftach sefatei meisharim.
Hear what is beneath my words, for my mouth's utterance, uprightness.
Goldie, number 7. Ki emet yehegeh chiki v'to'avat sefatai resha.
For my mouth declares truth, and my lips loathe wickedness.
Betzedek kol imerei fi ein bahem niftal va'okesh.
In the just are all the oral teachings, nothing within them twisted or crooked.
Kulam nochachim lemevin va'isharim lemotza'ei da'at.
They are all plain to the discerning and straightforward for those who discover knowledge.
Kechu mosarai va'al kasef edat mecharutz nivchar.
Take my instructions rather than silver, and knowledge is choicer than fine gold.
כי טובה חוכמה מפנינים וכל חפצים לא ישבו בה.
For wisdom is better than pearls, and all precious things cannot to be compared unto her.
Okay. אני חוכמה שכנתי עורמה ודעת מזימות אמצע. Alan. If you can unmute, please, Alan, if you want to join us.
I, wisdom, dwell with shrewd intention, attaining cunning, knowledge, and foresight.
יראת אדוני, שנות רע, גאה וגאון ודרך רע, ופי תהפכות שנאתי.
The wonder of God erases evil. Pride and ignorance, an evil way, and perverse speech do I hate.
Pride and arrogance, right?
Pride and arrogance, an evil way.
That's גאה וגאון. לי עצה ותושייה, אני בינה, לי גבורה.
I am true counsel and resourcefulness. I am right, discernment, mine is might.
בי מלכים ימלוכו ורזונים יחוקקו צדק.
Through me kings reign kindly, and lawmakers pass just laws.
בי שרים ישסורו ונדיבים כל שופטי צדק.
Through
16.
me princes rule lightly, and nobles, all the judges of the earth without bias.
אני אוהבי אהב ומשחרי ימצא עינני.
I love those who love me and show myself to all who seek me.
עושר וכבוד איתי, הון עתק וצדקה.
True abundance and honor are with me, enduring prosperity and righteousness.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Elisa, 19. Tov piryi mi charutz umi paz, utvuati mi kesef nivchar.
My fruit is better than all fine gold, and my yield than the choicest silver.
Be'orech tzedakah halech betoch netivot mishpat.
On the path of righteousness do I walk within the ways of justice.
Lahanchil ohavai yesh ve'otzrotehem amaleh.
Bless my lovers with abundance and fill their treasuries with timeless treasures. Their treasuries with timeless treasures.
Adonai koneni, reshit darko kedem mifa'alav me'az.
Adonai, my source, created me at the outset, and I am the very first of his works of old creation.
Me'olam nisachti merosh mikadmei aretz.
Before time I am, before the beginning of the first earthen things I am.
Be'ein tehomot cholalti, be'ein ma'yanot nichbadei mayim.
When there were no deeps, I was spawned. When there were no well springs, water sources.
Surely, 25. Beterem harim hat ba'u lifnei gvaot cholalti.
Before mountains were anchored down, elder to the hills, the valleys, and the fields.
Ad lo asa eretz vechutzot verosh afrot tevel.
Before even making earth and open land, even before the first clods of clay emerged, I am.
Ahachino shamayim shamani, bechuko chug al pnei tehom.
When he founded the heavens, I was there. Sorry. When he traced a circle upon the face of the deep.
Bamtso shechakim mima'al, be'azoz inot tehom.
When he made firm the skies above, when the fountains of the deep showed their might.
Besumo leyam chuko umayim lo yavru fiv, bechuko mozdei aretz.
When he set to the sea its limits, that the waters should not flout his design, when he appointed the foundations of the earth.
Great. Bev 30, Ve'ehyeh etzlo amon, ve'ehyeh sha'shuim yom yom, mesacheket lefanav bechol et.
And I was God's confidant and architect, a source of endless delight, playing before him without ceasing.
Mesacheket betevel artso, ve'sha'shuai et bnei adam.
Playing in the world, his habitable earth, and my delights with humankind.
Ve'ata vanim shimuli ve'ashrei, darachai yishmoru.
Now, therefore, children, listen to me, content who keep my ways.
Shimu musar ve'chachamu, al tifra'u.
Hear the reproof within instruction and get wise. Do not cast it aside.
Ashrei adam shomea li, lishkod al dolatotai yom yom lishmor mezuzot petachai.
Content is the one who hears me, to wait at my doors day after day, to watch the posts of my portals.
Ki motzi matzah chaim va'yafek ratzon me'Adonai.
For those who find me has found life and will be favored by Adonai.
Ve'chot'i chomes nafsho, kol masanai ahavu mavet.
And who offends me lays waste their life. All who hate me love death.
Wonderful. So this is a very, very intriguing chapter, especially in relationship to the 7th chapter that we saw and read through last time. So what are you noticing here specifically about the themes, the images in relationship to what we spoke about, and Goldie already started to comment on, that there is an apparent shift that is now taking place, because we're going to see this in terms of the concerns of human beings, not just of the tribe of Israel. What is it that is emerging here as uniquely described in this curriculum for wisdom transmission and cultivation? Do we have a different view of wisdom as the feminine here? Is there, remember I've sort of led you in a transition to think about it last time, and William Brown speaks about this in his book called Wisdom's Wonder, Character Creation and the Crisis. In the Bible's wisdom literature, he talks about a shift from character refinement to cosmic consciousness. So if we were concerned in chapter 7 about character refinement, and some of that still spills over here, where does the shift take place into an awareness of the universe and of cosmic consciousness in relationship to wisdom? Where do you see that shift happening? Morton?
22 and on. So wisdom was there before creation or through creation. However, I don't quite see the translations that you've used. I think you're editorializing in your translation, if I may say.
Where specifically?
Yeah, well, you keep on saying I am, but I don't. Now my knowledge of Hebrew is limited, but I don't see that to the same degree that you're putting that in. So I see use that in 23.
Yeah, that's a fair point. What I'm trying to convey, for example, in those verses, is this sense that really reinforces the call that comes, for example, in 17, where it says ani ohavai ahev, right? There is, and be through me. There's a constant li for me in 14. So and then specifically the reason why I'm doing it is because look at verse 12, ani chochma. Right, she's stating her case in the first person, not in the third person. So you're right. The issue is that there's places in the Hebrew that I have interpreted it strongly in that direction, based on the context, which is to try to evoke this conversation that wisdom is having. I think the problem that happens is that as you go from verse 12 onwards, right, because verse 11 is still being described with distance. Ki tova chochma mipninim v'chol chafatzim lo yishvu ba. It's third person. It's describing wisdom from a distance, that wisdom is better than pearls and all precious things cannot be compared to her. And then in verse 12, it shifts. Suddenly she begins to speak. So however we can become more aware of that in the translation, I agree with you. It is a heavy-handed translation, but the purpose is meant to draw our attention to the fact that that section really all the way through, once we make the shift from the third person description of Chachma in verse 11, basically I notice this shift to the first person from verse 12, where she's speaking pretty much all the way through, making the case of where she was when creation began its process, really all the way through where does that first person address begin to subside? It's still in 32, listen to me, right? She's still saying listen to me, and 34, listen to me, maybe up until and then even right up until the end, right? Even up until 36, turning your back on me and those who hate me. So really 12 to 36 is a very much a specific shift in the language that we have to come to terms with and be aware of. But I hear what your concern is.
No, I understand what you're doing, and I think you really have communicated this. I was just puzzled by some of the addition, but I'm not arguing with the characterization of the sections.
Okay, great. I appreciate it. This is a work in progress, so we're working on it together. So it's good to get your feedback. Other observations about what's going on here, Marian?
It strikes me that when wisdom is describing herself and redefining herself repeatedly, that she has certain touch points from which the comparison of who she, like the description of who she is, needs a touch point of comparison. So she.
Okay. Can you turn your volume up a tiny bit? I'm having trouble hearing you. The touch points of comparison is what I heard. Maybe just come closer to your mic, if you don't mind.
Is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
So just say that again, the touch points?
So every time she's describing herself, she needs some kind of touch point from which to. So God is one touch point, the act of creation is another,
Mm-hmm.
and the civic way, so man is one, the civic way that she's interpreted in good governance.
In terms of justice within the world?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it struck me that when she, and even time is sort of a touch point, because she is before time.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to describe herself, in order for us to understand what wisdom is, she has to point to sort of physical manifestations in our world, and those things are the creation, and therefore God and man.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Right. What's the risk if she doesn't have touch points? Let's just play that out.
I think the risk is that she's unidentifiable to us, that we can't grasp her.
Right. So that's, I think it's a very good point, is that the student or the disciple that wants to enter into this path is being, remember we said the axial age, one of the things that marks it is a move towards become more abstract thinking. So as that happens, the risk is that it's going to be very difficult to actually understand or even grasp what it is that is being pointed to here. You can continue to use all these metaphors of being, greater than all treasures and whatnot, but for example, being before time or a touchstone as God as the creator, those are all things that still are somewhat abstract. But when you look at the created world, as evidence of a process of creation, we can look at that and say, well, I understand what it means to live in the created world. So through a process of of inference or extension, I can begin to understand that there must have been something here before. And even though um, I can't necessarily understand all of it, I'm going to listen now to what you are pointing towards. So it's trying to, in a sense, maybe give us a roadmap or points of reference, as you call them, touch points, to see how this source of wisdom is something that actually has an impact on interpersonal relationships, on civic society, on justice, on the ordering of the natural world. All these things are reflections or manifestations of wisdom enacted within the world. So that's something that's very important. And we'll talk again about time. We'll come back to that, whether what this means to say that either that she was eternal or that she was before time. That's another example, Morton, where I was stuck with the in a bit of a bind with the translation, because when you say and you look at that verse in 23 and 24, me'olam. So we could spend a few hours just in this one word, me'olam. In the Hebrew Bible, olam is not the world, right? We're not talking about before the world, although we are also talking about before the world, but we're talking about before there was forever, right? Because mi-olam, le-olam in the Hebrew Bible generally tends to focus more on the sense of time than it does on space, even though the word means both world and time or eternity. So she's saying, I was here before there even was the possibility of understanding the difference between eternal time and the time of our calendars, for example. So we have to come back to thinking about how that relates to this relationship that is described that she has between the creator and time, which are those touch points that Marion is talking about, and whether anything about masculinity and the masculine and feminine archetypes help us to understand what's going on here. So let me go to Shirley and then to Elisa.
I was looking at 22 because it really frames how important Adonai saw wisdom in the fact that it was created at the very first of his works. So that when you look at priority and what is important before everything else. So that really follows what Marion was saying. It puts it in the frame of what's important.
Right, and specifically, let's just look at that verse again to make sure we understand it, because it's a bit ambiguous and elliptic, but it's saying Adonai koneni. Remember who's speaking now in the first person? Wisdom. So wisdom is saying that Adonai was my konen. That is, that Adonai was the one who made me. Reshit Darko. I'm wisdom in the feminine. It was at the outset of the mapping of the works of creation that needed to be made. I was the first thing that needed to be created. Kedem ifa'alav me'az, and I'm the very first of his works of primordial creation, of kedem, of olam. This is primordial time. So this is, in a sense, a very strange thing for us to contemplate when we're reading the Hebrew Bible. Why? What is strange in terms of the scenario that's being painted here that strikes us as monotheists as somewhat odd? What's the painting that's being painted here? Elisa?
That,
Go ahead.
Who is speaking? Bev? Elisa?
I was going to say it's
Goldie?
Goldie. That wisdom came before God.
Well, if wisdom came before God, then that would be shocking, right? That would be something
Right,
that
exactly.
would be a wisdom cult of Sophia, where the feminine and basically precedes the masculine. Here, well, it's not entirely clear what Yod He Vav He is. That's why I put the letters in. This is the oftentimes seen as the specific name of God related to the tribe of Israel, right? The tetragram, the hidden mysterious name, which is the name that relates to being. So being itself gives birth to or creates chokhmah. And so there's this series of, if you can imagine, like ripples in an ocean or concatenations of sound that have to echo out from this first primordial point, and from the larger infinite sense of being itself, there has to be something that now comes in closer towards this process of something that will eventually become a mind, but begins with its source in wisdom. And she is seen to be feminine, and the touch point for moving into the world of creation as an act requires both wisdom and time. Those are things that are required in order to be able to create a world, for example, and nature that exists within it, and then humanity that exists within it. So we're taking this step back. Now, if you look at the book, for example, the Hebrew Bible, and you flip again, as we've been doing before, flip the creation narratives and compare them. Now go back to Genesis 1. Bev, I think you were pointing to this. What happens in chapter 1, verse 1 of Genesis? What's the creation narrative that's discussed there? Take a look at that and now compare them. Specifically, look at the names of God, for example, and also look at the painting that is being portrayed there. What is the painting of creation there? Bereshit bara. What's the name of God being used there? Elohim, and not Adonai. Do you see that?
Yeah.
It's a different name of God being used to mark creation. So a lot of times in the book of Genesis, in the beginning, or in the process of the beginning of creation, Elohim created, etc., etc. Now, a lot of times, one of the helpful markers when I teach this creation story, and also when we look at Simchat Torah, and we look at the question of how we read as Jews this sacred text, we notice that the story of beginnings begins with the word Bereshit, which the first letter of which is what?
Bet.
What's the first letter of Bereshit? Bet. What would you imagine would be the beginning of a story if you're using language and you're using an alphabet?
Aleph.
Right.
Aleph.
So why? This is now a good question that clearly the curriculum of Mishlei understood. If you want to tell the story of beginnings, do you begin with Aleph, or do you begin with Bet? Do you begin with 1, or do you begin with 2? Now, that's a very interesting question. If you ask the Pythagoreans and some of the Greek philosophers, Plato, they all would have different answers as to how creation took place. It's a very, very deep and an endless conversation. But just for our sake right now, notice that within the Hebrew Bible itself, just in these 2 accounts of creation, and there are more, you can compare this to Psalm 104. You can compare this to sections in the book of Job. There are multiple narratives of creation within the Hebrew Bible that are different, that use different names of God, that have different ways of painting the scene. And the scene here, just to give you a sense of the divine symphony, as Israel Canol calls the Hebrew Bible, that's operating here, is, let's just focus in on Genesis 1 for a moment to appreciate the contrast and the vision. So when in Genesis 1 it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. In the beginning, when Elohim began creating the heavens and the earth, v'ha'aretz haita, the earth was, tohu vavohu. It was chaos and void, v'choshech al pnei tehom, and there was darkness upon the abyss, v'ruach Elohim, the spirit of Elohim, merachefet al pnei hamayim. That is a different story altogether than the one that we're seeing being recounted here in terms of the creation story in Proverbs 8. We have no mention of Elohim. The creative power here is Adonai, and there is no way to be able to begin the process of appreciating the way the painting is filled in with all the natural elements. Until in Proverbs 8, the first touch point that is required is that wisdom must be created. We would call this like a hypostasis. We can't say it's another God, because if we say another God is created, that's heresy. We're still in the realm of monotheism, but this is not the monotheism that we know of in the Shema. When the Shema says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai is our God Eloheinu, Adonai is Echad, which means what? How do you translate that? Tells you a lot about the way that you look at the Hebrew Bible and your theology and how you pray. What does Echad mean in that statement, that creedal statement of, if there ever was one in our liturgy? To say that Adonai is Echad, how do you translate it?
The one and only.
What did you say, Bev? The one and only. It just says one. Why is it the one and only? But as Morton would say, that's a very strong amount of editorializing. What are you anxious about? Why did you add the and only? Just say God is one. What is this and only? Where did that come from?
Because we have a history, and there have been other times when other gods have prevailed, and so we have to make sure that we have only one.
Okay. You could do that by just saying, and God is the one.
Right. Or God alone is one, or the one and only. So depending on how radically monotheistic you want to get, and you're completely you have a whole history of Jewish civilization to back you up. I'm pulling apart the seams now and showing you how we eventually are getting to that point, even though it's a long time coming. Now, this, for example, is one of the many alternatives that would require us to translate it the way you did. Was that when that anxiety becomes deeper in ancient Israel, and you have to say, well, there's Adonai and there's Chokhmah. So lest we become confused and pray to Chokhmah, we are going to create a series of blessings that use a formula praising Adonai and not Chokhmah or Elohim. Baruch atah Adonai. Okay? So you start to realize the rabbis were engaged in a very specific project of creating a certain kind of theology, a relationship to God that's reflected in the language and the way they understand their relationship to God, even though the Hebrew Bible is a canvas that is full of, it's a palette of many, many, many colors. The rabbis, when they decide to create liturgy and specifically the formulaic usage of language for blessing, they're limiting it in terms of what are the canonical blessings to praise Adonai. Okay, and to refer to Adonai, if you think of the way a blessing is recited, it tells you a lot about the way that human being relates to creative power. Baruch, blessed is the one, third person, nistar in Hebrew, passive. Atah, second person, masculine address. And then Adonai, third person address of the source of being. So it's a very interesting combination of steps that are used to make a formula in order to be able to acknowledge something powerful, wonderful, and amazing in our lives. We invoke that creative impulse each time we say a blessing. But here, just going back to what Bev was saying, the one and only, lest you pray to Chokhmah, which was taking place in other ancient mystery cults, and was taking place later on. So they tried to reach a point in ancient Israel where it was clear that there was a focus on the God of Adonai. That became, in a sense, as Freud would say, the totem god of the tribe. And there was this anxiety about all the other divine impulses animating the rest of the atmosphere that were part and parcel of agrarian society. We talked about that. So if it wasn't Chokhmah, it could have been Asherah, Astarte, and some of the other fertility goddesses that were part of the neighborhood of the agrarian lifestyle, where you would go to a temple for each of your specific needs within the natural world, primarily rendered in the feminine. And then with the dawning of civilization, the marketplace, the economy, taxation, and money exchange, you shift into a different way of seeing the world. Things become a little bit more abstract, transcendent, and less eminent. We become more disconnected from the earth because now we're no longer trading and creating produce, but we're trading and bartering with money. And so our image of God begins to shift as well.
I
And
have
here,
just
just to finish the thought 1 second, and here, I just want to give you a language to use to explain that move to the one and only, Bev, which is that here in these sections of the wisdom texts of the Hebrew Bible, especially, we notice this, as well as in some of the prophetic texts, that ancient Israel moves from, and we see this in the book of Genesis, when Abraham and Sarah leave Ur of the Chaldees, they are leaving a religious society which is what kind of society? What is the nature of God in that society in Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia?
Idolatrous.
Well, we call that, that's a judgment. That's not a description. I want a description before a judgment. We say it's idolatrous because, now describe what it was. It was polytheistic.
That's right.
So from a monotheistic perspective, that's idolatrous. For polytheists, it's not idolatrous. That's what they do,
That's
right? It means there was a God for everything. That's the way the universe is understood by a polytheist. And in the ancient world at that time, that was considered to be a great insight, but we evolve. And that's why Abraham and Sarah leave Ur of the Chaldees to make their next discovery, which is part of this movement towards the axial age, right? That will come later. But that shift is to break from polytheism, but they don't go straight to monotheism, right? From many theos, from many gods, to one God is not a straight path. There's some intermediate stages. And one of those stages is alluded to here in chapter 8, the move from polytheism to what we would call either henotheism or monolatry, which means that now we're moving from a space where there are gods everywhere and all competing for power equally, leading to chaos and many wars and conflicts, to a pantheon that's becoming more hierarchical, where it's possible, not in this case with the name Adonai, but in other places, especially in the book of Job, in the book of Psalms, you have, and in the book of Genesis, Abraham encounters this name of God, a very ancient name, which is the God known as El Elyon, El the most supernal. Why do we need to know if God's name is El, why do you have to say Elyon, the most supernal, or the highest of the high? The greatest of the great. Why do you, of course, if God is God, God is great, God is high. I don't need the extra descriptor Elyon. So why is it that when Avram meets Melchizedek in the beginning chapters of Genesis, or when Jethro blesses Moses, that they invoke the name of El Elyon? Because in that society, in that ancient Israelite society, they had a shared understanding amidst all the different tribes with their own totemic god, that there was a God above all those gods. There was the great God of the entire pantheon of all the tribal gods. And so that's a shift now from polytheism, where there are just competing gods swirling around the universe, to an organization, a kind of almost like a divine bureaucracy, right? Where you have a pantheon of the lower gods or of the tribal gods, and then you have a God who rules over all of these gods. That's why we call that God El Elyon, which, by the way, the rabbis were not necessarily uncomfortable with, because we praise that name 3 times a day. In what prayer? The prayer of the Amidah. After you praise the God of your ancestors, you say, the God of the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, El Elyon. So the residue is there, that we go from what is most neighborly and most in our vicinity, which is common in many cultures, the immanent experience, or what Rilke called the neighborhood God, to the transcendent God, which is El Elyon. So I'm bringing this to our attention because I want you to appreciate it hasn't gone away. It's just slipped into the nooks and crannies of the tradition, and we don't pay attention to it anymore. But in chapter 8 here in Proverbs, there's something remarkable going on, because it's a chance for us to peel back the layers and say, isn't this interesting? Look at what's going on. at the moment before the bet of Bereshit. What came before the bet? There was the letter
Oh,
Aleph. And Aleph is that place of Me'olam, right? Of Kedem. We have all these words in the Hebrew Bible that speak about something before time. If we had more time, which we don't have now because we're going to close in a few minutes, we would contrast this with the different narratives of creation of the world and the creation of time in different Near Eastern myths as well as in different Greek myths. But just as an example, sometimes we refer to early clocks in our civilization as what? What are some of the different names of clocks that we have if they're really fancy and you're really into watches? Some people, I think sometimes athletes use these. You have a special timer on your digital watch. What's it called, Marian?
Chronograph.
Right, a chronograph. So what's a chronograph? It's something that measures chronos, which is time. Chronos was the god of time. So in the Greek mind, it's very interesting to go back and to look and to see all the different component pieces that are required, as exactly as Marian said, these touch points in order for there to be something beyond the infinite. Judaism much later on, by the time we get to the 20th century with Franz Rosenzweig, he will say with the Star of Redemption, there is Gott, Mensch, and Welt. The first triangle of the Star of Redemption is God, humanity, and the world. And then there's a relationship between creation, revelation, and redemption. You put those two triangles together, you get the Magen David. It's a whole fascinating way to look at the two necessary trifectas or trinities of Judaism that have to intertwine in order for there to be a human race, humankind. In order for there to be a world, there needs to be God as a creator. But we never stop to think about what are those component pieces that have to come into alignment in order for there to be a movement from the world of the or from the experience of the infinite to something that becomes finite, right? When we say Adonai Echad, another way of saying and translating that phrase, which Maimonides uses in the medieval period, and he starts by saying that this is the foundation of Emunah, that God is Echad Yachid Umeyuchad. He uses, and you can hear in the language, it's all coming down from the family of the words that is Echad, right? God is Echad, one, Yachid, singular, Meyuchad, and unique, as you said, the one and only. So there is a sense that there is something about the infinitude which relates to a kind of untouchable perfection that is the divine, that requires an opening up of that infinitude to create something as finite as the world and as humanity. So something has to happen in order for this to take place. That process is what we begin to look into here in chapter 8. And it's very important to contrast that with chapter 1 in Genesis. And I would encourage you on your own time to read the Psalm 104, which is generally recited on Rosh Chodesh, which is another time of creation. It's a renewal of creation month by month. We're having a renewal of creation, a Rosh Hashanah today that we're celebrating called Tu B'Shvat. There were 4 New Years on the calendar of the rabbinic mind in the Mishnah. So they're already starting to see that time can begin again 4 times within the calendar itself. Not just to celebrate the birthing of the world, the birthing of humanity, the new year of the trees, and the new year of the animals. Those are 4 different times to start counting time again. So depending on how we do that, some say that the time of Tu B'Shvat was a time of taxation for the trees, right? So it was a tax cycle. But however you structure it, there is already a unique understanding that even within, which is what we've talked about now, that Judaism doesn't see time as being solely linear or solely circular. It's more of like a spiral Getty or a Mobius strip. There's something interesting about the way that Judaism looks at time. And we're just getting glimpses of it here. But the other thing that's interesting as well, again, part of that anxiety that Bev was touching on, and if you look at verse 30 in chapter 8, I'll leave you with this, 30 and 31, as we come into Tu B'Shvat, I'm thinking about these 2 verses. such stunning poetic language in the first person to say, this is now, again, the I am, right, Morton, that we talked about. The name of God that is revealed to Moses in the burning bush was?
I
What?
am that I am.
Eheyeh asher eheyeh.
I am.
I am that which is, I will be that which is becoming, is maybe a more
Oh,
accurate
I see.
translation. I am that I am sounds like Popeye the Sailor Man. So that's a literal translation, but it's much more complex than that. It's saying, I will be that which is becoming. Okay, so here, and I don't capture it well at all in this translation, but she's also speaking this is another name of God, Eheyeh, right? V'heyeh etzlo amon, v'heyeh shashuim yom yom, esacheket lechanav b'chol et. So I was in this place of divine, or of primordial bliss, delighting and dandling with God as the creator in the place, in the space of Eheyeh. And from that space, I was also able to play, to be playing within the habitable world. So it almost feels like there was some kind of prototype that was created, and that Chokhmah was able to delight in that as well as within humankind before the beginning of creation itself. There's some other time, some kind of blissful primordial time, like we see in the book of Genesis in the early chapters, that's like Eden, some kind of Gan Eden paradise experience. This is where Chokhmah is hovering. And so as we go into the celebration of Tu B'Shvat today, and we think about Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot, think about the ways that we can be wise in how we interact with the habitable world, that is a manifestation of God's wise creation, that was a project of playfulness and joy that we need to also delight in and to be responsible for. And I think that's part of the reason why Tu B'Shvat so delighted the mystics of 16th century Sfat, because they loved this repetition of the word Shashua. They loved to be able to enter into the place where God was in a space of delight and bliss. And when we enter into really appreciating the habitable world and the fruits of not only of our labors, but the fruits that emerge from nature, and we elevate them and find the spark of wisdom that created them, we are able to return to the source and to the root of creation. And that's a very blissful experience. So as you go through today, take some time to reflect on that. You're welcome to join us for the Tu B'Shvat Seder at 12. And in addition, I encourage everyone to read Psalm 104, and maybe we'll come back and do a little bit more comparison just to finish up with some of the issues in chapter 8 next